The Barrowland Ballroom in Glasgow was a place of escape. In the late 1960s, it was loud and alive. Music bounced off the walls. People went there to dance, to drink, to meet someone. It was a place for a bit of fun in a tough industrial city, but for three young women, the Barrowland was the last place they would ever have fun. Their deaths would create a legend, a ghost story that still haunts Glasgow. They called him Bible John. It started in February 1968. Patricia Docker was a 25-year-old nurse. She was a young mother, separated from her husband. She told her parents she was going out for the night. She was heading to the Majestic Ballroom, another popular dance hall, but she ended up at the Barrowland. We don't know why she changed her plans. Maybe she met a friend. Maybe she just felt like it. What we do know is that she never came home. The next morning, a man walking to work found her body. She was in a lane, just a short walk from her own home. She had been strangled. There were signs of a struggle. The police started their investigation. They interviewed her friends, her family. They tried to piece together her last hours. Witnesses at the Barrowland remembered seeing her. She was with a man. He was tall, with reddish-brown hair. He was well-dressed. But nobody knew who he was. The trail went cold almost immediately. The police had very little to go on. A young woman was dead, and her killer had vanished into the Glasgow night. The city moved on. It was a tragedy, but it was seen as a one-off event, a terrible random act of violence. Then, a year and a half later, it happened again. Jemima MacDonald was 32. She was a mother of three. It was August 1969. Like Patricia Docker, she told her family she was going to the Barrowland for a night out. It was a Saturday. The place was packed. Jemima went with her sister. They had a few drinks. They danced. Her sister left early, around 10:30 p.m. Jemima stayed. She was seen later in the night with a man. The description was familiar. Tall, slim, sandy, or reddish hair. He wore a smart suit. He was polite. He was quiet. Jemima MacDonald never made it home either. Her body was found 2 days later by her own sister. She was in an old abandoned building. It was just a few streets away from where she lived. She had been strangled with one of her own stockings. She had also been beaten. The similarities to the Patricia Docker murder were obvious. Both women were young mothers. Both had been to the Barrowland. Both were found dumped near their homes. Both had been strangled. Glasgow police now knew they weren't dealing with a random act. They had a serial killer on their hands. Fear spread through the city. Women were warned not to walk home alone. The dance halls, once places of joy, now felt dangerous. The police were under immense pressure. They set up a massive investigation. They interviewed hundreds of men who frequented the Barrowland. They took statements from taxi drivers, bar staff, anyone who might have seen something. They knew the killer was confident. He was hiding in plain sight. He could walk into a crowded ballroom, charm a woman, and lead her to her death. But they still had no name. They had no real leads. All they had was a vague description of a well-dressed man with reddish hair. And then, just 2 months later, the killer struck for the third and final time. This time, there would be a witness. Helen Puttock was 29. She was a mother of two. On the night of October 30th, 1969, she and her sister, Jean Langford, decided to go out. They went to the Barrowland. The place was buzzing, just like any other night. They had a drink. They saw a man standing alone. He was good-looking, they thought. Helen asked Jean if she should ask him to dance. Jean said go ahead. Helen danced with the man, but Jean danced with another man who was his friend. The four of them ended up spending the rest of the evening together. The man Helen was with introduced himself as John. He said he was from Castlemilk, a district in Glasgow. And Jean's companion also said his name was John, so they called them Castlemilk John and John. Helen's John was the one who did most of the talking. He was charming, he was polite. He didn't drink much, just a lemonade, but there was something odd about him. He kept quoting the Bible. He talked about Moses and John the Baptist. He spoke about adultery and how immoral dance halls were. It was strange conversation for a man trying to pick up a woman in a ballroom. He said he didn't like dens of iniquity, yet here he was in the middle of one. He seemed well-spoken. He had a slight stutter. Jean remembered his teeth. They were slightly crooked, with one overlapping the other. When the ballroom closed, the four of them shared a taxi. Jean's companion, the other John, got out first. That left Helen, Jean, and Ibble John in the cab. The conversation continued. He kept making religious references. He talked about his father thinking dance halls were sinful. Jean got out at her home. She watched the taxi drive off down the street, with her sister and the strange scripture-quoting man still in the back. It was the last time she would ever see her sister alive. The next morning, Helen Puttock's body was found in the back garden of her own tenement building. She had been strangled with her own tights. She had been beaten. The killer had even used her handbag to strike her. The police knew this was the work of the same man, but this time they had something they didn't have before. They had Jean. Jean Langford became the star witness. She had spent hours with the killer. She had talked to him. She had sat next to him in a taxi. She gave the police the most detailed description they had. He was tall, around 5'10". He had sandy, reddish-brown hair cut short. He was slim but well-built. He was wearing a smart, modern suit. And most importantly, she remembered what he said. The biblical quotes. The strange, judgmental attitude. The investigation went into overdrive. Based on Jean's description, the police brought in an artist. They created what would become one of the most famous composite sketches in British criminal history. It showed a young man with sharp features, neat hair, and a confident look. The sketch was printed in every newspaper. It was shown on television. It was plastered on posters all over Glasgow. The police were sure someone would recognize him. The press gave him a name. Joe Beatty, a journalist, heard about the suspect's habit of quoting the Bible. He dubbed him Bible John. The name stuck. It was perfect. It was chilling. It captured the strange, contradictory nature of the killer, a man who preached morality while committing the most immoral acts. The police launched a huge manhunt. They believed the killer was between 25 and 30 years old. He was likely single. He was probably intelligent and articulate. He might have a job that required a suit. They checked thousands of records. They visited every pub, every club, every guest house in the city. They even took the unprecedented step of asking every dentist in Glasgow to check their records for a man with crooked front teeth, matching Jean's description. Nothing came of it. The pressure on Jean was immense. She was taken to the Barrowland to see if she could spot the man. She looked at hundreds of photographs. She attended identity parades, but she never saw him again. The man in the taxi seemed to have disappeared from the face of the earth. The investigation slowly wound down. The leads dried up. The police had interviewed over 5,000 people. They had taken over 1,000 statements. They had spent thousands of man-hours on the case, but they were no closer to finding Bible John. The murder stopped. The city of Glasgow tried to forget, but the ghost of Bible John remained. He became a bogeyman, a story told to scare people. The case became Scotland's greatest whodunit. Years passed, decades passed, the files grew dusty, the detectives who worked the case retired. But the mystery never went away. Every few years, a new book or a documentary would come out. A new theory would surface. And then in the mid-1990s came a breakthrough. Or what looked like one. Science had caught up with the crime. DNA technology was now a powerful tool for police. The police still had a semen stain found on Helen Puttock's tights from 1969. It was a tiny sample, but it was enough they could now create a DNA profile of the killer. They compared this profile to a man who had been a suspect back in the original investigation. His name was John Irvine McInnes. McInnes was a former soldier in the Scots Guards. He was a cousin of one of the original detectives on the case. He had been questioned in 1969 but was cleared. He fit the general description. He was a regular at the Barrowland. He was known to be a violent man. In 1980, John Irvine McInnes took his own life. The police believed he was their man. They needed to be sure. They made a difficult decision. They exhumed his body from a cemetery in Stonehouse, Lanarkshire. It was a huge media event. This, everyone thought, was it. The final chapter in the Bible John story. They took a sample of his DNA and compared it to the sample from Helen Puttock's tights. The result was devastating for the investigation. It wasn't a match, it was close. The science, at the time, was complex. They were using a method that compared a limited number of DNA markers. The profile from the tights was a partial profile. The result was officially declared inconclusive. It didn't prove McInnes was the killer, but it didn't completely rule him out either. For the police, it was a dead end. The mystery was back to square one. The ghost of Bible John slipped away once again. But the story doesn't end there. There have been other suspects, other compelling theories. One of the most talked about in recent years is Peter Tobin. Peter Tobin was a monster. He was a serial rapist and murderer who was caught in 2006. He was convicted of killing 3 young women, but police believe he killed many more. He was active during the right period. He lived in Glasgow at the time of the Bible John murder. He even had a connection to the Barrowland. He met his first wife there in 1969, the same year the last 2 murders took place. The police launched a special investigation, Operation Anagram, to look into Tobin's past. They wanted to know if he could be Bible John. There were some striking similarities. Tobin was cunning. He was charming when he needed to be. He was capable of extreme violence. He moved around a lot, which could explain why the killing suddenly stopped in Glasgow. He had a religious background. He was brought up in a strict Catholic home. The idea of a man quoting the Bible while being a killer wasn't a stretch for someone like Tobin. Some people who knew Tobin back then said he looked like the famous photo fit. Others disagreed. When Tobin was an old man, he looked nothing like the sketch. But a photograph of him as a young man showed some resemblance. The age was right. The location was right. The timing was right. But there were problems with the theory. Tobin's known method of killing was different. He buried his victims. Bible John dumped his victims in public places. Tobin was a rapist. While Helen Puttock's body had semen on it, she had not been sexually assaulted in the way Tobin's other victims were. And then there was the DNA. Police took Tobin's DNA and compared it to the sample from the tights. It was not a match. For many, that was the end of it. Tobin was not Bible John, but some experts have argued that the sample from 1969 could have been contaminated, or it might not have belonged to the killer at all. Perhaps Helen Puttock had consensual sex with someone else before going out that night. The DNA evidence, which once seemed like the key, had become another source of confusion. Peter Tobin died in prison in 2022. He never confessed to being Bible John. If he was the killer, he took the secret with him to the grave. There was another suspect, too. A man who, for a time, seemed the most likely of all. This story came from Jean Langford herself, the only witness. Years after the murders, in the 1980s, Jean was shown a photograph of a man. She reportedly identified him as the man from the taxi. He was the man she knew as John. This man was not a known criminal. He was a respectable family man. He had lived in Glasgow at the time and later moved away. The police apparently looked into him. They interviewed him, but no charges were ever brought. The story remained a rumor for a long time. It was said that the authorities felt there wasn't enough evidence to go to trial. For Jean's memory, decades after the event might not be enough to secure a conviction. The man has since died. His name has never been publicly released. It's another tantalizing what if in a case full of them. So, who was Bible John? Was he John Irvine McInnes, the soldier who took his own life? The DNA was inconclusive, but the circumstantial evidence was there. Was he Peter Tobin, one of Britain's worst serial killers, hiding in plain sight? The timeline fits, but the DNA and the methods don't quite line up. Was he the unnamed man that Jean supposedly identified years later? A man who lived a normal life while hiding a terrible secret? Or was he someone else entirely? A man who was never a suspect, someone who left the country or died or simply stopped killing. Someone who blended back into the city and was never caught. The truth is, we don't know, and we will probably never know for sure. That's what makes the Bible John case so enduring. It's a perfect mystery. It has all the elements of a chilling story. The setting of the dance hall, a place of light and music that turned dark. The victims, 3 ordinary young women looking for a night of fun. And the killer, a figure who was both terrifying and fascinating. He wasn't just a murderer, he was a character, the smart suit, the polite manners. The quotes from the Bible, it created an image of a man who was deeply conflicted. A man who hated the sin he saw around him, but was drawn to it himself. A man who judged others while being the greatest sinner of all. This contradiction is what makes him so memorable. The case also tells us a lot about Glasgow at the time. It was a city in transition. Old industries were dying. New housing estates were being built. It was a city of close-knit communities, but also a place where someone could get lost. A killer could operate in the crowds of the Barrowland, then disappear into the maze of tenement streets. The investigation itself was a product of its time. Without modern technology like CCTV and widespread DNA databases, the police had to rely on old-fashioned detective work. They had to rely on witnesses, on instinct, on legwork. They did the best they could with the tools they had. But the killer was too clever or too lucky. Today, the Barrowland Ballroom is still there. It's a legendary music venue. The famous flashing star sign still lights up the Glasgow sky. But for those who know the history, it holds a darker memory. It's a place forever linked to Scotland's most famous unsolved crime. The families of Patricia Docker, Jemima MacDonald, and Helen Puttock never got justice. Their children grew up without their mothers. Their killer was never held accountable for what he did. He became a legend, a myth. But for them, the pain was real and it never went away. The Bible John story is more than just a true crime case. It's a piece of social history. It's a cautionary tale. It's a puzzle with a missing piece. The photo fit of the handsome, smiling young man is still recognizable to many Scots. It's the face of a ghost, the face of a killer who walked out of a taxi and into history, leaving behind only 3 victims and a name that would never be forgotten, Bible John. He remains, to this day, Scotland's greatest whodunit. The question mark hanging over the city of Glasgow. It's a story with no end.